Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to part 23 of Quranic Contemplations, where we're going to be looking at and contemplating verses from the 23rd juz of the Quran. The first surah, or the first ayah we're going to be looking at is from Surah Safat, verse number 102, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam and how Ibrahim alayhi salam raised his son Ismail, and he says at the beginning of the verse, فَلَمَّا بَلَغَ مَعَهُ السَّعْيَ, and when he reached with him the age of exertion, meaning when Ibrahim alayhi salam was with Ismail, and Ismail reached the age of exertion, the age of puberty, the age of adulthood, he became an adult. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here doesn't say when Ismail reached the age of adulthood or the age of puberty, the age of exertion. He says when he reached with him the age of exertion, meaning the age of puberty. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about Ibrahim alayhi salam being with Ismail when he becomes an adult. And he could have easily have said when Ismail became an adult. But he says when he reached with him the age of exertion. When Ibrahim alayhi salam was with Ismail when he became an adult. And this shows us the closeness that Ibrahim alayhi salam had with Ismail alayhi salam. Because of how Allah Azza wa Jal mentions the fact that Ismail became an adult, and he became an adult with his father, almost as if Ibrahim alayhi salam was with him every step of the way, guiding him, teaching him, and telling him whatever he needs to know as a child, in order for him to grow up to become a strong adult, and somebody who's responsible, and somebody who's pious and righteous, and somebody who is given that tarbiyah and that education as a child is supposed to be given. And again, this is a lesson for all of us when it comes to our children, that as opposed to distancing ourselves from our children when they become teenagers and adults, instead we're supposed to become closer to them. That bond should become stronger. Because in this ayah, Allah talks about how Ibrahim was so close to Ismail, it was almost as if he was guiding him as he was becoming an adult. He was teaching him, guiding him, educating him, giving him the necessary tarbiyah and education for him to become a strong, confident adult. And that process and that stage of his life was a smooth transition from childhood to adulthood. And of course, we see this also in the rest of this verse when his son is being told about a dream that Ibrahim alayhi salam had of him sacrificing his son, and how Ismail alayhi salam tells him, "Oh my father, do whatever you've been ordered to do," meaning slaughter me as you have seen me being slaughtered in your dream. And again, this shows us the closeness that the father and the son had with one another. The second verse we're going to be looking at is in Surah Sad, verses number 22 and 23, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about these two verses where Dawood alayhi salam was worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he comes across two people who climbed over a wall, and they wanted Dawood alayhi salam to judge between them. Now, what's interesting about this verse, or these verses, is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says that these two people, they approached Dawood alayhi salam, and Dawood alayhi salam was worried and scared because these two people came over the wall to approach him. He didn't know who they were. They came out of nowhere. He was surprised. So they said, "La takhaf, khasmani bagha ba'duna ala ba'd." We are two adversaries, like opponents, and one of whom has wronged the other. So we want you to basically judge between us, and فَحْكُمْ بَيْنَنَا بِالْحَقِّ, judge between us with truth. But they describe themselves as adversaries, opponents. And in the next verse, one of them says to Dawood alayhi salam, "Inna hadha akhi," indeed this is my brother. So he's explaining the situation. Now what's beautiful about this is that even though they were adversaries, even though they were opponents, even though they were two people who had conflict with one another, They had issues with one another, so much so that they had to go to the king, to the judge, to the courts, basically, to get some kind of judgment and some kind of ruling in favor of one of them. He still calls him his brother. That love that he had for his adversary was still there, that he still called him his brother. And this shows us the importance of always remembering and always realizing that even though we may have disagreements with people, uh, they may be family members. We may even consider them to be adversaries when it comes to work, when it comes to studies, when it comes to people who are in our community, our neighborhoods, people that we compete with, from a business perspective or whatever the case may be. We should always remember that these people are still our brothers. And we should have an element of love and respect and empathy for those who we may be uh, in competition with in this world or even in the hereafter. But there should always be that sense of love and brotherhood there, regardless of the personal situation and the problems that may arise between one another. The third verse is also in Surah Sad, in verse number 35, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the supplication that was made by Sulaiman alayhi salam. And he made dua and he said, "Oh Allah, forgive me and grant me a kingdom. وَهَبْ لِي مُلْكًا لَا يَنْبَغِي لِأَحَدٍ مِّن بَعْدِي." Give me a kingdom such as will not belong to anyone after me. So basically, Sulaiman alayhi salam is supplicating and asking for a kingdom that nobody would ever have after Sulaiman alayhi salam passes away. And we know the kingdom Sulaiman alayhi salam had, how he would travel long distances by controlling the wind, how he was able to speak to animals and he had control over the animals, and the animals were in his army. He had soldiers from the army, from the animals. He had control over the jinn. He could understand the language of the animals. He had this amazing kingdom and this great power that he was given and bestowed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Here in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah Azza wa Jal tells us in this dua that he made, he says, don't give anyone this kingdom that I've been blessed with, that I've been given. لا ينبغي لأحد من بعدي. Give me a kingdom that no one will have after me. And this shows us the importance of having ulul himma, high aspirations whenever we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for something. Because Sulaiman alayhi salam never said that's something which is impossible. Maybe it's a bit selfish. Maybe I shouldn't make dua for something like this. Maybe, it's not realistic. He's making dua and he's having high aspirations when making dua. Likewise, when we make dua, we should always aim to be the best. We should always aim for the highest possible thing that we could ask for. And this is why when we ask for Jannah, we ask for Jannatul Firdaus. We ask for the highest stations of paradise. Likewise, in this world, when we ask for things, we should always ask for the best when it comes to children, when it comes to family, when it comes to good deeds, when it comes to anything that we make dua for. We should always aim for the best. We should always have high aspirations. We should never think something is too much for Allah, or we're asking too much from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or something is impossible. Because with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, anything is possible, as long as we have the firm belief and faith that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will respond and will give us whatever we make dua for. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Jazakumullah khair for listening. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.